Dazed and Confused. Off a budget of $6.9 million, this Richard Linklater film made $8 million globally. Not so much when you think about the impact that the film had on home entertainment, home video, that's right, VHS, in the years to come. But it is a classic, and if you're here with us this week, clearly you know where we're about to go. Our guest this week, Melissa Maerz, writer, journalist, author. Her new book, All Right, The Oral History of Richard Linklater's Dazed and Confused, hits shelves November 17th from HarperCollins. We sat down with her and talked to her about the how, the where, the when, and the why, and who cried while she was interviewing them. The entire cast she sat down with, over 100 people, hundreds of hours of interviews, and the commentary you're about to hear from Melissa represents all of the Easter eggs that did not make it into her book. It's an amazing compliment to the book, which is out this week. Now, if you've been listening to the show for a while, you're saying to yourself, I'm so confused. Why is there a commentary episode and an interview episode? Didn't they used to be one and the same? Quite astute podcast listener. We decided, we meaning me, we decided to split these things out on a week-to-week basis. Make it easier for you to catalog, compartmentalize, and genre file all of your podcast episodes. So, if you started listening here first and you didn't get a chance to listen to our interview with Melissa Maerz, please stop right now. Go back. Listen to the interview, and then come back here where you can queue up your copy of Dazed and Confused and listen to Melissa and her feature-length audio commentary. But for those who are already ready to go, let's do it. So here's Melissa Maerz, her feature-length audio commentary of Dazed and Confused on the Sidetrack.
Okay, let's start this up. It always makes me laugh that there's an FBI anti-piracy warning in the beginning, because piracy is pretty much directly responsible for Dazed and Confused being a really popular movie, because did not terribly well at the box office. I think it made about $8 million on a budget of around $6 million, but really the reason that it's a cult classic today is because people copied it. So thank you for pirating Dazed and Confused. It's also funny, it starts out with this Universal thing. You know, Universal, Linklater spent the entire process of this movie fighting with Universal over everything. And this is kind of detailed in my book, over the soundtrack, over the schedule, over the budget, over the casting. So it always cracks me up that there's this big Universal thing right in the beginning of this movie, because I think they drove Linklater crazy throughout the entire process of making this movie. It's also interesting, you know, that Universal was even making a movie like this. At the time, they were making Schindler's List, which had a budget for like $25 million, and Jurassic Park, which I think was around $63 million, and Dazed and Confused had a $6 million budget. So it really was a time when studios made this slate of films. And, you know, Linklater talks about how they really don't do this anymore. Like, he says if he came to them even a few years later and said that he wanted to make Dazed and Confused, they would have just been like, fuck you. So starting this movie with Sweet Emotion, everybody says is one of the best needle drops of all time, especially with this GTO, this beautiful car coming around the bend here. But it's especially smart from Linklater because Aerosmith was still touring in the early 1990s. So teenagers who watched Dazed and Confused in 1993 would still be driving around listening to Aerosmith, just like kids in 1976 were when the movie is set. I think like two of the best-selling Aerosmith albums were out at this time. I think Pump was out in 1989 and Get a Grip was out in 93. Teenagers kind of doing the same thing in the 90s that they were doing back in the 70s. It's funny, you know, Linklater always says, when I was a teenager, we just never wanted to listen to anything our parents listened to. It was so uncool to listen to what your parents were listening to. But I think in the 90s, you know, a lot of what people were listening to was like Zeppelin and Bob Dylan and Aerosmith, and apparently we didn't have that rule. Also, a funny thing is that Linklater chose the song Sweet Emotion when he was in the dentist chair under nitrous oxide and suddenly got this vision of the GTO coming around the bend. He says he was on legal drugs. But he wanted to do this, and he ended up spending, I think, $100,000 on Sweet Emotion. So think about his previous film was Slacker, and he made that for $23,000. So already in the first couple of seconds of this movie, he spent $100,000. So it just gives you a sense of this being a much bigger movie than Slacker was. Oh, Last Day of School, May 28th. It's a funny thing. Linklater's daughter, his first daughter, Lorelai, was born on May 29th, the day after this movie is supposed to take place. He got his girlfriend pregnant during the making of Dazed, which I talk about in the book. And it was an unplanned pregnancy, but he ended up having his kid. And I think that's kind of a funny bit of kismet that she was born the day after this movie takes place. And also, my birthday is May 29th, so maybe I was also destined to write this book. This Uncle Sam. So this is an interesting thing. So, I looked through Linklater's yearbooks when I was writing this book, and there's actually, because they had a door in his high school that all the kids would decorate, I think around 4th of July. And there's actually a picture or some kind of mural-like thing of Uncle Sam at Linklater's real high school in 1976. This scene was shot at Bedichek Middle School in Austin. It's the same middle school where Mason gets bullied in Boyhood. And I think this mural is still up there. I think they painted that mural of Uncle Sam and then let the cast actually put in the bloodshot eyes. And I've been told that the mural of Uncle Sam is still there and that they keep repainting it, but the kids kind of make the bloodshot eyes all the time. Of course, you can't help that. So they're talking about playing poker here. Linklater really had a real poker group when he was growing up in Huntsville, Texas, and there was a real Tony and a real Mike who played poker with him. These characters here, Adam Goldberg's character is Mike, and Anthony Rapp is Tony. So those are based on real guys. And listen to this dream. I'm going to let you listen to this dream for a second that Tony's talking about, and then we'll talk about it. Okay, so this is a funny thing. Linklater's real friend, Tony Olm, who he grew up with in Huntsville, actually had this dream about Abraham Lincoln. What's funny is that his dad was a history professor, and I guess they went, somewhere in the land of Lincoln and were revisiting Lincoln's history, and Tony slept in some kind of Lincoln-like bed when he was a teenager. And he says that was where he had his first wet dream. And apparently he told this dream to some kid in his high school, and it got around. And he said for years and years later that he was teased about having this dream. And I guess Linklater must have heard about it and put it in this movie. But Tony Olm did not know it was going to be in the movie. And later on was kind of taken aback that this private dream of his about Abraham Lincoln ended up in this very public movie. So this is another real thing, this drug pledge that Sasha Jensen's character is talking about was a real thing that they had in Texas in the 70s that coaches would give to players. Some of Linklater's friends remember them having it at Linklater's school. Linklater doesn't remember that specifically, but it was a real thing. Apparently some kids got kicked off a team somewhere in Texas for not signing it. I love, by the way, that this character, Benny, there's a big sign that says, wear your goggles, and the entire time he has his goggles on his forehead. Okay, so Jody, this character Jody is saying, can you let Ms. Wilk know that we're going to the bathroom? Ms. Wilk was also a real person. She was Linklater's teacher in Huntsville. She was the head of the Hive, which was their school newspaper that Linklater wrote for and Tony Olm wrote for, and all these people. And she apparently was very thrilled that he gave her a call out in this movie as Ms. Wilk. She wrote a piece about it in the Huntsville Item, which was the local paper, talking about how excited she was that she's named in the movie. This neo-McCarthyism thing is also a real thing. Tony Olm apparently wrote an English paper about neo-McCarthyism, so that's kind of a shout out to him too. I love this scene with the girls in the bathroom, and I love this thing about Gilligan's Island being a complete pornographic male fantasy. This character Kay, who's played by Chrissy Harnos, was a much bigger part of the original movie, and her part ended up getting cut down. It's something I talk a lot about in the book. I love this character. I feel like this would have been me when I was in high school, probably a mix between Kay the feminist and Tony the nerd. But it's too bad. Chrissy Harnos is such a great actress that her part got so cut down. And Linklater said he actually felt like he failed with the women and ended up writing Before Sunrise to give more of a women's perspective. So this scene here with Michelle Burke, who plays Jody, and Cole Hauser, who plays Benny, is kind of cute because in real life, Michelle and Cole kind of had a fling during Dazed and Confused. There's a whole chapter of my book about the flings between cast members. Everybody was hooking up with everybody. Everybody had a crush on everybody. But Michelle says that filming this scene together was the first time that she kind of felt like, ooh, there might be something there. I think Cole was like 17 when they shot this movie, and Michelle was in her mid-20s, so she was an older woman. Okay, so I want to give a shout out to the costume designers. These T-shirts that these kids have in this scene, apparently they were recreated from Linklater's real yearbook, that there were a lot of T-shirts in there that the costume designers recreated. And the hat that Cole Hauser is wearing here, I guess, I've been told that it says 6-course meal, or 7-course meal, and it's a 6-pack and a bag of pork rinds, which is just genius. Another thing that's funny about this scene is that Cole Hauser apparently was a huge Christopher Walken fan. And you can really hear, once somebody told me that, when you listen to him giving these speeches, he's so Christopher Walken in this movie. And you think, like, why would this high school kid be talking like Christopher Walken or like he's in a Scorsese movie or something? But I guess that's why. And it kind of makes this villain an even better villain, because it's almost like he's performing for these kids, you know, like he really wants them to think that he's this tough guy. And he's really convinced himself that even just in paddling these kids, that he's like in Mean Streets or something. I think it's kind of a nice way that Cole Hauser is deepening this performance of this bully. These coaches. Okay, first of all, the shorts. I mean, these shorts are amazing. So this character is Coach Alpert. And he's one of the characters, or many, many characters, whose names are the same as real people who Linklater grew up with in Huntsville. Coach Alpert was the real name of the assistant coach. Linklater played both football and baseball in high school. And this thing that this coach is going to say about his grandmother, I guess, was a real thing that Coach Alpert used to say. And this breakdown thing was a real thing that Coach Alpert did. So the coach yells at him and says, Randy Floyd. This is, I think, the first time that you hear that his name is Randy and not Pink. There was a real Pink Floyd in Huntsville, although his name was Richard Floyd, but they did call him Pink. So that's another example of a real name. And Richard Floyd joined with Bob Wooderson, who is the namesake of Matthew McConaughey's character, and Andy Slater, who's the namesake of Roy Cochran's character, and they ended up suing Richard Linklater for using their names in the film. Linklater says that he actually didn't know them that well. He just kind of used their names as a call out. But the lawsuit is something that I cover in the book. Okay, here is our first introduction to O'Banion, who is also the namesake of a real guy, O'Bannon. And I love that in this movie, everyone's car is kind of a character in itself, or you can see what the character is like based on their car. Like, for instance, Pickford has this really nice rich kid GTO that it's obvious that his parents are rich and got him. And O'Bannon has this total beater of a truck. And one of the first things he says is that it's out of gas. So even though he drove it there, when they're chasing the kids around, they're not going to use his truck. And when you see the little kids driving around, the junior high kids, it's obvious that they're driving around in their parents' cars. I think it's like a station wagon or something. It's a really nice touch for character development that you can see who they are based on their cars. I mean, Sasha Jensen's so funny in this movie. This scene is amazing. So this is Kim Krazan. She's in Slacker. I think her character's name is something like Questions Happiness. And an interesting thing about her is that she also co-wrote Before Sunrise, and it's partly inspired by her own life. I guess she took some solo train rides through Europe when she was a young woman, and created those characters with Richard Linklater. And I think you can really tell in those movies that they have a very significant female perspective in a way that Dazed doesn't, as much as Linklater wanted to. And I think that's probably a credit to her. Okay, look at Mark Vandermeulen's hair there. He's the guy on the left. He definitely has the worst hair in a movie full of lots of people with terrible hair. He had a wig, but I guess what they did was they cut his real hair around his wig. So he said that when he went back to high school, he just had the worst hair, and people were like, what movie were you in? And why do you have that haircut? And it's pretty great. His hair in this movie makes me laugh. It's one of the greatest lines in a movie that's full of incredible lines. I also love, Linklater said that he was worried about the music being used too literally. I think this is an example of that, of Alice Cooper's School's Out being used when school is literally getting out. But I kind of love that, because when you're a teenager, all you want is music to speak for you. You want the most literal music possible. And I remember times where, we'd be doing things as teenagers where you're like driving around in your car and you want to play a song that's literally about driving around. And Alice Cooper's so perfect too, because he's just the epitome of somebody whose entire persona is engineered toward pissing off people's parents. There's this great story in his manager, Shep Gordon's memoir, about the album School's Out, and how Shep Gordon had apparently read in the newspaper about some company trying to send paper underwear. I don't know why people wear paper underwear, but a shipment of paper underwear into the port of Baltimore, and it got confiscated because you're not, something about like the Flammable Fabrics Act, that you're not allowed to send fabrics into the U.S. That are flammable. So Shep Gordon heard about this, and he decided that they wanted to put paper women's underwear, wrap them around the album of Alice Cooper's School's Out. And then he did a genius marketing thing. He used not flammable underwear for the real albums, but he also had flammable paper underwear sent into the U.S. And called this guy at the Washington Post and told them that it was going to be confiscated. And then, of course, this underwear was confiscated. And the Washington Post wrote this huge A1 story about how there was a panty raid. They used the word panty raid in an A1 story. And of course, there was this huge free promotion for Alice Cooper, and all the parents were like, who's this guy who's putting women's underwear on the cover of his album? And then all the kids went nuts and bought the album. So Shep Gordon and Alice Cooper, a really genius marketing there. So this strange thing with the pacifiers, there's so many things in this movie that people were like, that's not believable. They wouldn't literally give the kids pacifiers, or they wouldn't literally paddle them with wooden paddles. These things actually happened in Linklater's hometown of Huntsville. There was a yearly thing where the senior girls would give pacifiers to the younger girls who were incoming freshmen and put them in the back of cars and take them to this parking lot. And they had big sisters, as they called them, to look out for the freshman girls to make sure that they were okay. And this paddling thing is real. Linklater remembers actual guys. There was a real guy named Don Dollar who I talked to. You know, there's this character, Sasha Jensen's character's name is Don. And he remembers literally driving around in a truck with a paddle that they had made in shop class, chasing after these incoming freshman kids. So these are real things that happen. It's a weird thing. I think Roger Ebert was like, yeah, that wasn't a believable thing. That's the only downside of this movie. And everybody who I've talked to from Huntsville is like, that was the realest thing. Actually, I shouldn't be laughing. It's a pretty messed up thing to do. So this is such a great moment here with Affleck catching these kids and, you know, almost the glee that he shows, almost getting to paddle them. And he gets caught. And Linklater says that this moment when Carl's mom comes out with the shotgun is kind of Linklater's call out to Night of the Hunter. You know, and there's the older woman, I think it's Lillian Gish, on her front porch, you know, aiming her shotgun at Robert Mitchum. I think Linklater was a big Night of the Hunter fan and just kind of used this as a tongue-in-cheek reference to that. I also love Ben Affleck saying there's some ruffians about and I'm trying to protect these kids. Linklater says that when he first made this character that he was just kind of a scary asshole, and that when Ben Affleck auditioned, you know, you could still see him playing a really good asshole, but that he also brought a kind of charm to the role and that he's kind of funny and you almost feel sorry for him a little bit. Same thing with Parker Posey. So Linklater said when he originally envisioned this role that he just envisioned somebody who was just, I think his words were kind of butch, like really strong, athletic, you know, mean girl. And that when Parker Posey came in, he saw her as just kind of this almost melodrama queen. Like I think Don Phillips, who cast this movie, said that she reminded him of Katharine Hepburn. And I think she brought a different level to this character, that she is way more theatrical and again kind of charming. She's not just this mean girl. You kind of see why people both love her and hate her. And even this moment when she's like, smile, you love us. It's almost like she's talking to the audience. Like, it's really dangerous. You know, you play her with too much charm and you risk making this movie seem like a cruel movie. But you play her with not enough charm and you kind of can't understand why these kids are doing what she says. So I think she plays that middle ground perfectly. So by all accounts, filming this scene was terrible. I think it was like 100 degrees that day, and that pavement was literally cooking some of that food. They used real ketchup and mustard because I guess the props people couldn't find a good match for the color, so they just ended up using real ketchup and mustard. A lot of those girls told me that to this day they can't stand the smell of ketchup or mustard. They can't put it on anything because it just turns their stomachs. And again, this was a real thing from Linklater's high school. The girls I talked to, the women now, I guess they are, told me that they were really covered in mustard and ketchup and rotten eggs and just terrible things. They were really forced to propose like this girl is being proposed, or is being forced to propose. And this anything you want was apparently a thing they actually had to do. The spit or swallow thing, it just makes me want to cry whenever I watch it. I think when I was in high school, I really hated this scene because I remember having guys say asshole things like that to me, and I really hated that Linklater included it. But I think now that I'm older, I watch this and it feels very real. And you see some pushback there. Like you see Slater saying that's not cool. And you see Dina Martin's character Siobhan saying that's not cool. And I think he kind of shows this as there's not really an adult perspective here. He kind of shows it the way that kids remember it. And I respect that decision. You know, I feel like the only good guy in this entire movie, I mean, Pink's kind of okay, but he's cheating on his girlfriend, is Anthony Rapp's character, Tony. I just adore this character. Maybe because I was also kind of nerdy in high school, but I like that he's the antidote to these raging meatheads in this movie. And he brings up this idea of this being an accepted ritual in this town. And that was a real thing too. I guess in Huntsville, this blows my mind. It wasn't just the high school kids who came out to watch these hazing rituals. The parents came out to watch this. The teachers came out to watch this. I mean, this is insane to me. And it went on for years and years and years until I've been told, I guess one girl who was participating got something in her eye and she had to be hospitalized. And then I guess they stopped, kind of put the kibosh on doing it. By the way, number 77 that you see right there, that's Renee Zellweger. I don't think she has any lines in the movie, but she's an extra. I kind of love that Hitchcock's family plot is in the background. I think that was Hitchcock's final movie. And there's a lot of little touches like this about it being the end of an era. Like, it's kind of touching that these kids have no idea that this is the end of an era. Obviously, you know, it's not really the end of the era because they're juniors. They're going to be seniors next year. It's not truly the end of high school. But they just have no idea that there's a limited amount of time that they're going to be able to just, you know, drink beer all day and listen to music all day and drive around and not really have to do anything. And I think that Hitchcock shout out is a nice reference to it being the end of an era. This was also a real thing. I talked to one of the women from Huntsville whose family owned the car wash that they'd go through afterward. And I want to give a shout out to Lee Daniel, the DP on this movie. Check out this shot. This is such an amazing shot. He literally rode that nozzle with his camera with a garbage bag around it to prevent it from getting water on the camera and shot this amazing scene. Lee Daniel was Richard Linklater's roommate for 5 years. He was the DP on Slacker and a bunch of other movies. And he just has a really nice kind of guerrilla filmmaking touch in a movie that's a studio movie. Okay, my favorite thing, watch Slater step on this plant and the sound that the plant makes. I don't know why that cracks me up, but it does. Okay, another real thing from Linklater's life. In the original shooting script for Dazed and Confused, this scene, Sabrina's being let off in front of her house, but in the original script, she wants them to let her off, not really in front of her house. She wants them to let her off in front of a different house that she's pretending is her house. And then she goes around back to her real house, which is a much smaller house. And it's very clear that she kind of comes from a lower or maybe working class family. She goes inside and her mom is in a maid's uniform. And there's really a lot more about class in the original version of this movie. And Linklater says that came from his real life, that, he was kind of poor and he didn't really want to let people see where he lived. And I guess his mom was on set when they shot that part, and he was kind of trying to distract her, like, oh, hey, look, let's go over to craft services, because he didn't want her to know that he'd put this scene in the movie. It ended up getting cut out. So a great thing about this room is that it was recreated from Linklater's memory of his friend from high school's room, that the friend had that same egg chair and the same posters, and just all the details, and including this, see Pickford take the ice pick out of the door that he's using to keep the door closed. That was a real thing that Linklater's friend had to keep his door closed too. So this guy who plays Pickford, Sean Andrews, there's a big part of the book about how everybody hated this dude, that he just thought he was, I guess his manager took out an ad before he was even in the movie that said congrats to him and that he was going to be the next Marlon Brando, which is kind of hilarious because, of course, the real next Marlon Brando would never call himself the next Marlon Brando. But you could kind of see how dramatic he is in this movie. Like he's almost like he's a character who's been like teleported in from a different movie, a very dramatic movie. And you can really see that when he confronts this beer delivery guy in this scene. So the guy who plays the beer delivery guy said that Sean Andrews wanted to go through this scene like 20 times of just like, hey, man, hey, man, hey, man. And finally he was like, this isn't a scene where it's like someone's dying. Like you're literally just talking to the beer delivery dude. And by the way, that beer delivery dude is like a super famous voice actor. I think he's in a bunch of anime stuff. I talked to somebody about interviewing him, and my friend was like, oh, that's the dude who played like Soul Eater. I can't remember what his actual roles were, but apparently he's a famous guy. So this is another real story. These statues, these Kiss statues, this came from Lee Daniels' brother, Bill Daniel, who's also an artist. Apparently when he was in high school, he and his friend, how you used to go through the McDonald's drive-through and there was a Ronald McDonald there, and, he'd have a little speaker in his stomach that would say, welcome to McDonald's, and you'd have to order. Well, they stole this Ronald McDonald from the drive-through and painted it up like Kiss when they were in high school. And somehow word got around, and I guess they were caught. So the next Monday, when they were at school, they were called into the principal's office, and the cops were there, and they separated Bill Daniel and his friend. And Bill Daniel and his friend luckily had discussed this ahead of time of, what they were going to tell these cops. So they brought them back to the place where they had said that they found this Ronald McDonald. They didn't say they stole it, obviously. Then the cop asked them, was it face up or face down? So Bill Daniel just guessed, and he was like, face up. And luckily, that's what the other guy had said too. But apparently this used to be, in the original version of Dazed, this was a through line in the movie. That's why the statues are in the movie. That some of the characters in Dazed steal the statues in the beginning, and then the cops come at the end, which is why you see the cops coming on to the football field at the end. Originally, the cops were busting them for stealing the statues. But then McDonald's wouldn't let them use the statues, and it ended up getting largely cut out of the film for a bunch of reasons I talk about in the book. Okay, here's another funny thing. Wiley Wiggins, when he was being auditioned for this role, Richard Linklater, who actually was really good at baseball when he was in high school, asked Wiley Wiggins if he could play baseball. And Wiley was like, oh yeah, I totally can. And it turned out he'd never thrown a ball in his life and was so bad at baseball that when they were shooting this scene, he was just throwing it like the exact opposite direction every single time. So they ended up having to use a double for Wiley Wiggins. You can see that they cut away from him every time you actually see the ball get thrown. And Wiley says he still remembers that there were all of these middle school kids who were extras, who were on the baseball team in the background there, who actually did play baseball in real life, who were just mercilessly teasing him the whole time for being terrible at baseball. So watch this scene. It's like they have a close-up and then make sure you don't show Wiley Wiggins' face. Obviously not him. Cut away. Yeah. So here's a funny thing. I'm going to wait until you watch these guys. But at some point, Sasha Jensen, who plays Dawn, you can see him in the background there. When you see him running after Wiley Wiggins, you see him trip. And he told me this was the one and only scene that he was actually high for. Lots of people were high in this movie at various points, and you can kind of see him trip. You'll see that later. Good game. This was one of the many scenes that Richard Linklater and Dazed and Confused producer Jim Jacks fought over whether it was really necessary to be in the movie. They had kind of a screaming fight about it, which I talk about in the book. But I think it's one of those examples of something that Linklater really got right, that it's the details that people... Oh, there's Sasha tripping. Sorry, I missed that. But it's the details of this movie that people remember from their childhood. So many people, including Ethan Hawke, talked about remembering doing that good game kind of glove tap after they played baseball when they were kids. I think it's a really nice moment. And also, if you'll notice, it's one of the teams, the baseball teams, is Van Patten Plumbing. The Van Pattens was kind of a code name, nickname that Linklater and the Austin crew gave to the people at Universal. Whenever the Universal people were around, it was like the Van Pattens are coming, and you kind of had to like put your weed away, as one of them told me. So I think they kind of took a dig at the Universal people by making the opposing baseball team Van Patten Plumbing on the back of their uniforms. So there's a big part of the book is people's memories about Cole Hauser and Ben Affleck. Some of the freshman kids remember them kind of trying to intimidate the actors in real life and just getting really into their roles. And some of them remember they say, being hurt for real by Cole Hauser and Ben Affleck. So some of the kids remember Wiley Wiggins getting hurt for real by Cole Hauser in this scene. Cole Hauser says that he remembers Wiley Wiggins crying when he hit him. Wiley Wiggins says that wasn't true, that he was kind of rigged up with a device that prevented him from being hit. And Wiley says that I think they blew like menthol smoke in his eyes to make it look like his eyes were watering or like he was crying. So Wiley says he was safe. But some of the other kids remember him getting hurt, and Cole Hauser definitely says that he remembers him crying. And some people remember there being kind of a competition between Affleck and Cole Hauser about like who could intimidate the real freshman actors more. But I think it just shows, whether or not that's true, it just shows how the mythology of this movie really blurred with real life, that people really got into their characters. And especially for the kids who were really in high school, there's a real blurring of their real high school experience and the mythology of what this movie remembers as being a kind of collective high school experience. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's so popular. I mean, so many people watched this movie and told me that was my high school. People remember very specific details from this movie being things that mentioned their real high schools. So Richard Linklater says that both Pink, even though he was named after the real Pink Floyd, and there is a real Mitch Kerr in real life, Linklater says both those characters were actually him. You know, that Pink was him when he was a junior, and that Mitch was him when he was an incoming freshman, and that this scene here is really him, the junior year him talking to the freshman year Linklater, which I think is kind of a poignant thing. Let's listen to it here. And this is also true. Linklater was on a baseball team, and he says they call it getting licks being paddled. But he says he got licks from a teammate, that he was pretty shocked that once one of the teammates on his baseball team was like, hey, this guy's waiting for you at his car. And Linklater went over there and the guy gave him licks. And he said that, like, for a whole summer, he was basically bruised on and off that whole summer. But Linklater insists that he never gave licks to the younger kids, that by the time he became a junior, he was like, that's stupid, I'm not doing it. And he convinced his friends not to do it either. Also, it's so crazy to me that it's like 1 minute they're beating the hell out of this kid, and then the next minute they're like, hey, you want to hang out? And of course, this poor kid is like, sure, yeah, cool, let's hang out. I mean, I'm laughing, but it's so messed up. I mean, there's so many things in this movie that are so messed up that the kids do that's kind of presented in this documentary style where, again, nobody's commenting on it, nobody's moralizing about it. It's just the way things are. So Lowrider, there's so many songs in this movie that were very personal to Linklater. This is one of them. I guess Lowrider was his CB radio handle when he was in high school. And I also like that Linklater never really uses deep cuts in this movie. It's a lot of hits. It's stuff you would hear on the radio. He doesn't pretend that these high school kids have cooler taste than they actually would. Another thing I really love about this movie is the cars. I think it's funny, a lot of these actors told me that they couldn't drive standard cars, and just kind of they're really awkward in how they drive, but that seems real to me too. So this line about she called you a bitch and you a slut. There are rumors, that this scene was actually about the way that Parker Posey and Joey Lauren Adams felt about Michelle Burke in real life, that those actresses did not get along. And Parker Posey and Joey Lauren Adams did write this scene themselves. They say that it wasn't necessarily about Michelle Burke, but you can read a little bit more about the dynamic between those three women in the book. It's pretty interesting. I really like these three characters, the nerds in this movie, because to me they're evidence of how Linklater was really kind of fuzzing the edges of these stereotypes that you saw before this in so many teen movies. Like in the 80s, remember this was only 1993 when this came out. So in the 80s, you'd see so many characters where it was like a nerd was literally a character in glasses with tape around his glasses with an annoying laugh who never got laid. It was just very specific stereotype. And this is really the first time I remember seeing a teen movie where the nerds have these kind of cool conversations. They're almost conversations like you'd see in Slacker. They're really smart. They're really political. They get invited to the party. It's kind of an unusual thing to see in a teen movie in the 90s. I missed this. Sorry, you can rewind. But so McConaughey's character, Wooderson, the first lines you hear from him in this movie are not, all right, all right, all right, which a lot of people think is his first line. It's, all right, let's rock and roll. That's his first line in the movie. So you do hear, all right, all right, all right, here as he's coming in his car, but you don't see him say it. It's kind of off screen. So I think it's funny, he says it a couple times in the movie, but you never actually see McConaughey say it. You just hear him saying it. And yet it's the most quoted line from a movie that's full of quotable lines. I'm going to read you the McConaughey quote about where he says it came from. Hold on just a second. Okay, so this is what he says in my book. I'm saying to myself, what's Wooderson about? Well, he's about his car, his 70s Chevelle, that's one. And Wooderson's about getting high. Slater's riding shotgun, and Wooderson's always got a doobie rolled up. He's about rock and roll. He's got Ted Nugent Stranglehold playing on the 8-track, and he's about chicks. Right about this time, I hear action. In my mind, I go, well, he's got 3 out of 4 of these things, and there's the 4th one that I'm pulling up to get right now. All right. So maybe that's how it went. It's possible, but there's also a really great YouTube supercut of McConaughey saying all right in basically every movie he's in. So I wouldn't be surprised if it's just kind of a tick that McConaughey says, and if maybe retroactively he convinced himself that this was how it came about. It's also possible that it's totally exactly how he says. He would know better than I would. But I think all actors kind of have these verbal tics. Adam Goldberg told me that he says pal in every movie he's in. And I think it's funny that you hear him say all right in so many movies. And you hear him say all right in 2 movies that he's in addition to Dazed and Confused. But I think that really shows how McConaughey really sees this as a symbolic thing, that he repeats all right constantly. I mean, he repeated it at the Oscars because I think to him, it symbolizes his launch pad into Hollywood. It was the first significant line that people remember associating with his character. Here's these kiss statues again. Oh, one thing I missed that I wanted to say is that Wooderson comes into the Emporium to Bob Dylan's Hurricane. And the rock critic Stephen Hayden made a really good point about this song, that it's the perfect song for Wooderson to walk into, because it's a song about this guy who could have been the champion of the world. It's all about this wasted potential, and Wooderson is a character who is full of wasted potential. That's basically all he is. I mean, you hear other characters throughout the movie calling him woulda been. He's this older guy who was so cool when he was in high school and just isn't anymore. And I think that Bob Dylan song is kind of a perfect pick for him to walk into that. By the way, it also cracks me up that when they're inside the Emporium, that somebody calls Pickford Prickford. Apparently in real life, because the cast really didn't get along with Shawn Andrews, the actor who plays Pickford, that was their nickname for him, Prickford. There's more about him in the book, but apparently he was just an actor that all the rest of them hated. These are just beautiful scenes of them driving around in the car. I just really love the cinematography here. It's also a thing that's really of that era too. It's like a car is kind of your freedom from the world of adults, and also kind of your protection from the world of adults. Like, you're safe in there. They're drinking beer in the car. They smoke weed in the car. They're throwing garbage cans at mailboxes from the car. They don't really have to worry about adults seeing them because they kind of disappear back into the car. And at the end of the movie, when you see Pink, refusing to sign the drug pledge, he gets back in the car and you see them get away in this car. You really see it as kind of this symbol of freedom for these kids. And it's just a funny thing that it's not the same anymore. I'm not saying it's better or worse, but when I talked to Sasha Jensen, he has, the actor who plays Don, he has teenage kids, and he was like, my teenage kids don't even want to drive anywhere anymore. They just take an Uber. I think it's just a very different experience for teenagers now. They're not going to spend their nights driving around all night. So I love this junior high dance scene. Jeremy Fox, who plays Hirschfelder in this scene, is making out with this girl in this room with the black lights. It's an interesting thing. So he's originally supposed to make out with a different actress, but she decided she didn't want to make out with someone on screen. You know, she's pretty young. It's understandable. So Jeremy Fox got to pick the girl who he makes out with. And this young woman here, her name is Deanie Wallace. He picked her because they were really good friends in real life in high school. And he, I guess, had always had a crush on her and wanted to have a chance to make out with her in this scene. And I think was maybe, he didn't say this, but was maybe hoping that having this scene together would bring them together in real life. But when I talked to Deanie, she was like, oh, it was just kind of one of those things where you're like kissing your brother. And she said that after the scene was over, she literally told him, wow, I can't believe I kissed someone and didn't feel anything. It's just like, oof, sorry, Jeremy Fox. You see so many moments of just pure toxic masculinity in this movie. I mean, oh, these junior high kids talking about how the girls are going to put out in high school. It's just so awful and so real. Okay, so this scene when the kids are running away from Cole Hauser and Ben Affleck again, this is a scene where Jeremy Fox remembers being hurt for real. Cole Hauser remembers that when they were chasing these kids, you'll see in a little bit, Cole Hauser is running and he trips and falls down. And Cole Hauser says that after he tripped and fell down, that he was kind of so worked up from this. He wasn't mad at Jeremy Fox, but he's so worked up that he threw him against this fence for real. Jeremy Fox says that Ben Affleck paddled him for real in this scene and that he was really bruised. Ben Affleck says absolutely not. That definitely didn't happen. And Ben Affleck says also that he was kind of typecast in these bully roles during this period. Like you see him playing a bully in School Ties. You see him playing a bully in Dazed and Confused. You see him playing a bully in Mallrats. And he said an interesting thing that one of the reasons why he wanted to play the character he did in Good Will Hunting is that he realized that people aren't really going to appreciate when you're playing a bully. They just think you're a dick in real life. I think he even said that Quentin Tarantino called Richard Linklater after seeing Dazed and Confused and was like, who's that guy? What an asshole. And he was like, I didn't want Quentin Tarantino to think I was an asshole. So after this, he decided he didn't really want to be playing these bully roles anymore. Another thing, poor Jeremy Fox. So you'll see in a minute that Jeremy Fox walks up and Sasha Jensen throws him this beer. Apparently, Jeremy Fox says that after he was paddled, he says, for real, Ben Affleck says that's not true, in that one scene that he walked up and Sasha Jensen threw beer to him and accidentally hit him in the face with the beer and chipped his tooth. So Jeremy Fox remembers after this unending night of filming, walking home and being bruised and bleeding and having a chipped tooth and it just being kind of a bummer night. Oh, hey, fuck her, I did, that quote. Interesting thing, that comes from Jason Lee, the actor who was in Almost Famous and My Name is Earl. So Jason Lee, by some weird confluence of events, was the boyfriend of Marisa Ribisi, who plays the redhead character Cynthia in this movie. Marisa Ribisi was underage. I think she was 16 when she was in this movie, but she was dating Jason Lee. He was in his 20s. He was a professional skateboarder at the time. He was not an actor. But because she needed a legal guardian to be with her on set, he volunteered to be her legal guardian, even though he was, by all accounts, partying harder than Marisa Ribisi was. So maybe not the best guardian. But anyway, he really credits Dazed and Confused with making him want to be an actor because he was there at the hotel. There's a big part of my book that talks about how much fun they had partying at the hotel. And he said that he watched all these people being in this movie and really decided that he wanted to become an actor too. So there's a scene that was cut out of this section of them being outside the Emporium at some point, where all the girls are lined up, and there's another young girl who comes out of this car where she's driving with this older guy, and they talk to her about losing her virginity. I think you can find it. It was cut out of the movie, but I think you can find it on YouTube. It's a really great scene, and another scene that got cut out that I think really shows the women's perspective. All the girls are talking about what it's like to lose your virginity, and they're asking her what it's like, and like, how big was it? And she talks about how big it was, and they're all kind of giggling. But it just feels like a very true to life scene to me. And the actress, Adam Barr, who played the girl who loses her virginity, said that in the original version of the scene that she was going to get out of the car and Richard Linklater was going to play the guy that she makes out with. And I asked Richard Linklater about this, and he was like, oh my God, I'm so glad that I didn't end up playing that role. Like, what a messed up thing. I also love it that Parker Posey grabs Wooderson's ass before she goes into the Emporium. I think that's a smart thing that they have her grab his ass instead of the other way around. There's little subtle ways where you know that Wooderson is a creep, but the movie kind of undercuts the danger of this creep. But he's still a creep and maybe a bad person, but this movie could have made him look like a much worse person than it does. And I think part of that is also a credit to McConaughey, that he kind of brought a dangerous charm to that character. You know, Linklater originally said that Wooderson was supposed to be a real gross dude, just a total skeevy, nothing charming about him guy. And that when McConaughey auditioned, he almost didn't want to put him in this role. That he felt like he was wrong for the part because McConaughey was like too clean cut. That McConaughey really had to convince him that he was right for this role. And you can see this here too, this scene that's coming up. The famous line that I get older, they stay the same age, about the high school girls. Just such a gross, terrible line. But, you know, you do see, again, some pushback. Like, you see Sasha Jensen's character saying you should be in jail. You see other people kind of not just thinking that it's a funny line. So I think it's well handled. And just watch this little butt waggle that McConaughey does here. By the way, he delivered that line like right after his dad died. Like, he'd basically just driven back from his dad's funeral. It's kind of amazing that he can have this fantastic comedic scene after such a harrowing thing happened to him in real life. I love this discussion of shotgun. That Slater's like, you know, I got shotgun. I'm coming back. You can have it now, but, you know, I'm really going to get it back when I'm back. It just shows you how, where people sit in the car, who they're in the car with. All these things are just kind of symbols of status in high school. You forget about that. It's like you used to drive around with people who you never would have hung out with if they didn't happen to be in the same car as you. You know, people are always talking about switching cars in this movie. I talked to people from Texas who were in the crew of Dazed and Confused, who talked about how you'd stop at a stoplight and everyone would switch cars. It's just kind of telling of, you know, Mitch being the kid in the back seat, very clearly in the back seat in a car full of more popular kids. So this mailbox baseball thing of throwing these trash cans, I can't tell you how many people have told me that they did this in real life, or they heard stories of people doing this in real life. Okay, so this is a funny story. So apparently this is a real thing that Richard Linklater's friend did when they were in high school. You'll see in a moment that Wiley Wiggins is going to throw the bowling ball out the of the car door. So Linklater had a real friend who did that in real life, and he put it in this movie. But I guess Wiley Wiggins was not supposed to actually throw the bowling ball out the door of the car. And he did it, and you can see this kind of look of surprise on his face when he does it. It's kind of great. Okay, watch this scene here, and then I'll talk about it in a minute. So the car was on a pulley, and he did this, and I guess a lot of the guys in the crew were like, oh shit, and the ball was like rolling down the street, and rolling, and they're like, no, trying to catch up to it, and it rolled into somebody's house. And I guess the story is it rolled into the house of Jimmy Dale Gilmore, who is of the great Texas band, the Flatlanders. And Jimmy Dale Gilmore went into his backyard and just randomly found a random bowling ball in his backyard, which I find hilarious. I also love that they're faking out Wiley Wiggins' character here and pretending like they're stealing the beer, but they're not actually stealing the beer. He's actually paying for it. I guess the legal age to buy beer in Texas, or at least in Huntsville, at the time was 18. So this is true to life. Linklater says this is a real thing that probably happened a lot during that time. I love Wiley Wiggins is just so great in this movie, his expressions. Okay, so this is another real thing. This is Fred Lerner with the gun here, a great actor and stuntman. But Linklater says that in real life, when he was in high school, he was driving around with his friends and they were kind of causing mischief, and they did get chased. No one pulled a gun on him, but they got chased around town for, he says, a significant amount of time. They stopped at a stoplight and this guy kind of revved his engine, was really tailing them, and they started to get really scared. And Linklater believes the guy might have had a gun. I forget why he said he believed that, but I guess this is based on a real thing that happened with them. And at the end of the night, they kind of had to lie to the guy's parents who was driving the car and pretend like nothing bad happened, because I think they might have gotten dinged on the back of the car from this guy who was chasing them. Lots of real stuff from Linklater ended up in this movie, which is probably why the more specific this movie gets, the more universal it seems. I think a lot of people can identify with a lot of the specific things from Linklater's life, weirdly enough. Okay, so you'll see this pinball machine coming up. Pinball's really important to Linklater. I think that, a lot of his friends from Huntsville who he grew up with remember him being somewhat of a pinball champion. And you'll see pinball in a lot of his movies. I think this actual pinball machine is one that he still owns to this day. You'll see Linklater playing pinball in Waking Life. You'll see Ethan Hawke playing pinball in Before Sunrise. And I think it's kind of a nice metaphor for Linklater's vision of life. There's this great quote from him that he says that he doesn't believe in fate. He believes in timing and randomness. And I think, God, that's pinball right there. Timing and randomness, right? And I think one of the great things about Dazed and Confused is it really came together because of timing and randomness. I mean, Richard Linklater told this film critic about this idea he had for this high school movie. And the film critic ended up telling this producer, Jim Jacks, who happened to be starting his own production company at the time and happened to be looking for some indie filmmakers to hire to make a studio movie with Universal. And it was really the only time when they were making, as I said, these $6 million movies at a place like Universal. So I think timing and randomness really played a part in the story of Dazed and Confused as well. I talk a lot about that in my book. Two funny things about this. This woman right here smoking, this pregnant smoking woman. She's not actually pregnant, but her name is Kahani Cooperman, and she is Linklater's one-time girlfriend, and she was also filming a documentary about Dazed and Confused at the time, so it's kind of a funny in-joke that she's this pregnant lady here. I talk more about her and Linklater's relationship in the book. And this guy, this liquor store clerk, is the actor David Blackwell, and he is also the liquor store clerk in Boyhood. You know, there's a lot of these kind of callbacks between movies of Richard Linklater's. I also think, you know, Adam Goldberg in the very beginning of Before Sunrise happens to be sleeping on the train that Ethan Hawke and Julie Delpy are on in Before Sunrise. And I think it's kind of a point that all these movies, like you could talk about like a Richard Linklater universe where all these characters kind of exist in each other's universes. Like Mitch is, you know, a freshman in 1976 and he's playing baseball. And then in Richard Linklater's movie, Everybody Wants Some, it's 1980 and it's about a baseball team. So you could really imagine Mitch being on the baseball team in that movie. And there's a lot of kind of consistencies between his movies that are interesting, but I think it really comes back to all of these characters are Richard Linklater. And I think that's probably true for most filmmakers, but most filmmakers aren't as honest about it being so specific to their lives as Linklater is. I also love, by the way, that Wiley Wiggins, when he walks back into the Emporium, he's walking in a way that kind of mirrors the way that Wooderson first walked into the Emporium in this kind of slow motion shot. And you also hear him emulating what Wooderson says before. Like Wooderson at some point is like, I'm working for the city. I got change in my pocket. And then when you hear Wiley Wiggins' character, Mitch, talking to the liquor store clerk, he says the same thing. You kind of watch the slow corruption of this Mitch character throughout this movie. It's kind of sad. He starts out as this really sweet, innocent kid. And over the course of this night, you see him kind of learning to emulate these older kids, some of whom are real assholes, and thinking that, you know, the way they're acting is cool. I mean, even the fact that you hear Affleck saying, okay, homo, I hope you're ready. It's like, don't heroize these older guys. They're assholes. Oh, by the way, the Emporium was also a real place. It was actually called the Emporium. It was where Linklater and his friends hung out. So that's an interesting detail too. See, okay, for example here, Sasha Jensen's character Don kind of schooling Mitch on how to be a total asshole. Like, tell her, nah, I got my own ride, but maybe I'll see you later. Like, why does he have to do that? Why not just ride with the girl and be a nice guy, dude? That's what girls actually like. Here's a hint. They don't like assholes. Okay, so here's an interesting thing. So throughout this whole movie, there was major fighting between Jim Jacks, the producer of Dazed and Confused, and Richard Linklater about the cursing in this movie. There's a ton of cursing in this movie, which, of course, that's realistic. Teenage boys, especially, and teenage girls, too, like to curse. But at one point, they really wanted to make this movie PG and wanted him to cut down on the cursing in the movie. So there's a big fight between Jim Jacks and Linklater about this the whole time. So Affleck calls Carl, this character, a cocksucker. But I guess in one take of this, he called his mom a cunt. And Jim Jacks, when he was watching the dailies of this scene, just lost his mind. I mean, Jim Jacks and Richard Linklater were fighting throughout the entire process of making this movie, which is a big part of what I talk about in this book. But this was just a moment of like, he'd had enough. So after he heard Affleck say cunt, apparently he went after Affleck and was super pissed and threw a can of soda or beer or something at him, and it broke. And then he chased after Linklater, and Linklater was like, I was actually preparing to fight him. Like, I was thinking, where in the face am I going to hit him? He's just kind of preparing for this. And they didn't actually fight. They kind of had a showdown that culminated in Jim Jacks punching a telephone pole, and his hand was bleeding. And I guess he had some PA that was like, Mr. Jacks, would you like me to clean up your hand? And he was like, no, I just want to bleed the entire time. But Sean Daniel, who was the other producer on this movie, was like, I'm so glad that he didn't hit Rick. I think Affleck is really great in this scene of how pissed off he is. And a lot of the actors said that they were really scared of him in real life during the scene, that he just seemed furious. And again, I think that's a real credit to how good he is in this movie. Top Notch is a real place in Austin that's still around and has some Dazed and Confused memorabilia in it, because they're real proud that they shot this there. The real version of Top Notch in Huntsville was a Sonic, but I guess they, since they were in Austin, they ended up using Top Notch. Oh, there's the second. All right. I love the way this scene is filmed, that you can see it through the car windows like that. You're really kind of seeing it from the perspective of Anthony Rapp's character and Adam Goldberg's character, who just think Wooderson is just so gross. Originally, the scene wasn't in the movie. I guess they needed to find a way for the nerds to find out where the party at the Moon Tower was. So Wooderson tells them that there's a party at the Moon Tower. But Richard Linklater's sister had the idea that Wooderson should be into Cynthia, Marisa Ribisi's character, because she was like, this guy's kind of been with everyone. Maybe he thinks he wants something different, and he wants kind of the redhead intellectual. I love that. And I also think it's kind of believable, because Cynthia is really smart. And if you were really smart, you might want to date an older guy. Maybe you're kind of sick of these immature guys who are all around you, and Wooderson might not be the height of an intellectual, but maybe you're kind of like, yeah, maybe an older guy is someone I could talk to about neo-McCarthyism. And Marisa Ribisi said that she came up with the idea of him loving those redheads because she always got comments about like, hey, redhead, is there fire in the crotch? There's these Kiss statues again. Funny story about Kiss. I guess Richard Linklater was originally going to do a radio show with Gene Simmons talking about the movie and about Kiss's music. And at the last minute, Kiss backed out. And the reason that was given to Linklater was that they didn't want to be associated with drugs and alcohol. Whoa. And Linklater's like, are you fucking kidding me? Like, the guys who wrote Rock and Roll All Night don't want to be associated with drugs and alcohol. So they didn't end up doing the radio promotion. But I guess later Gene Simmons ended up liking the movie and maybe changing his mind about it. But Richard Linklater's like, he probably doesn't even remember this whole thing because he called me Art Linklater the whole time. Okay, I just love this party scene. So many party scenes that you see in the 80s, and even really that you see since Dazed and Confused, just make parties seem like the screenwriter has totally forgotten what an actual high school party looks like. Like, you always see somebody like at some rich kid's mansion, like falling fully clothed into a swimming pool or something ridiculous. I've never been to a party where someone fell fully clothed into a swimming pool. I think you even see that in contemporary movies. But this looks so unglamorous and so realistic to me. It's like everyone's greasy. It's kind of boring. Everyone's just sitting around. There's nothing really all that interesting happening. It just looks very real to me. I think he did that very well. Okay, this is a funny thing. So They get in a fight. Adam Goldberg's character gets in a fight with Nicky Katt's character because he says someone's been smoking some reefer. So many people say to me, again, like that doesn't seem realistic because if you were a real stoner, you wouldn't be aggressive like that. Like if that guy was on coke, maybe he'd fight with this character. But if he was just a stoner, he probably wouldn't care. But again, weirdly, this came from a real thing. So when Richard Linklater auditioned all these people, he had the kids who were auditioning tell him real stories from high school. And I guess one kid who was auditioning told him he got in a fight like this because some guy overheard him say someone's been smoking some reefer. So even though this kid didn't get put in the movie, Linklater remembered that and put it in the film. It's also kind of interesting that Nicky Katt's character says, I'm here to kick ass and drink beer, and looks at him like I'm all out of beer. It's actually a line he stole from the movie They Live. It's anachronistic because They Live came out in 1988, and the real line is, I'm here to kick ass and chew bubblegum, and looks like I'm all out of bubblegum. So that's kind of a funny thing. Oh, yeah. So they're at the moon tower. So in real life, there was a fire tower, not a moon tower, that Richard Linklater grew up. All the kids in Huntsville would climb the fire tower and kind of drink beer at the top. But there are real moon towers in Austin, as a lot of people know. It's kind of an interesting bit of history. So Austin put their moonlight towers up. They're called moonlight towers or moon towers in 1895. I think in the beginning it was a way to bring electricity to the city and light the streets. And a lot of towns, it wasn't just Austin, a lot of towns around this time did that. But then about 10 years around when the towers went up, there were a series of grisly murders in Austin by a serial killer known as the Servant Girl Annihilator, who killed a bunch of women. And those murders were never solved. But I guess having these moonlight towers up made people feel a little safer at night. And I guess over the decades, over the century, really, other cities have taken down their moon towers, but moon towers are still in Austin. People don't really party under them or really climb them. Or if they do, it might just be kind of to mirror the movie, but they're a real thing. Actually, I've been told by this guy who made a documentary about the moon towers that there was the story they tell about the freshman falling down and smacking his head on the ladder all the way down. There is a real story like this about an 11-year-old kid who fell off the Moonlight Tower and lived. But Linklater says he didn't remember that he just kind of put that story in. It might be a coincidence. Again, Anthony Rapp, so sweet. It's funny. So there's all these stories in the book about all of these actors kind of terrorizing the hotel where they were staying and partying, like, ripping things off the walls and turning over ashtrays and stealing food from the kitchen and all this stuff. And everybody's like, Anthony Rapp was the only one who didn't do that. Oh, so another thing, so there's this guy, Peter Milius, who was the boyfriend of Dina Martin, who plays Siobhan. And he was just around because he was Dina Martin's boyfriend. But apparently he was the guy who would park just off set and fill his car. Oh, by the way, real quick, that's Renee Zellweger holding that beer bong for Parker Posey. But anyway, Peter Milius would park just off set and fill his car with real beer and weed. And people would wander off set, when they weren't being shot. Like, for instance, when they were shooting the fight scene with Adam Goldberg and Nicky Katt, the actors who didn't have to be there for that scene would kind of wander off set and go to Peter Milius's car and get high or get drunk. So even though there wasn't real weed and beer on set, the actors would still find a way to kind of get messed up and wander back to set. And the I don't know, maybe I shouldn't find this funny, but a lot of the extras, I guess, ended up getting kind of tanked. And the costume designers and like wardrobe extra people would tell me that they would like find these extras in the bushes and like have to like get them back to the set. And by a lot of accounts, a lot of people just said that this really felt like an all-night party as they were shooting it. Oh, this is kind of interesting. So this conversation that Benny has with Pink about no one quits senior year, especially if you're the starring quarterback, was inspired by some real things, according to Linklater's friends. Linklater left his high school after junior year. So he left Huntsville to go to Houston for his senior year, and he was a quarterback on the football team. And a lot of his friends have told me that they were pretty upset. It was like, I can't believe that you're abandoning us. This thing about it ain't just about you, pal. It's about us. You're fucking us over, was a real thing that they felt. Like they could not believe that he would leave them his senior year and abandon the football team. I think the coach, I've been told, was very upset that Linklater left before senior year. So this is based on a real thing. Oh, again, there's a rumor that Joey Lauren Adams tripped for real in this scene. I find this scene hilarious. She says that it was definitely scripted. Linklater says it was definitely scripted. Other people might not agree. So this is an interesting thing. Mila Jovovich, this song that she's singing, was a real song that she wrote. It was originally supposed to be Neil Young's After the Gold Rush in this scene. But I don't know if you remember, but she was actually a aspiring singer-songwriter at this time. She had an album with the Divine Comedy. She had kind of a hit with a song called The Gentleman Who Fell. And this was a song on that album. I think it was called The Alien Song, and she ended up just playing it in the movie because Neil Young wouldn't let them have the rights to put the Neil Young song in here. Okay, the George Washington stuff is one of my favorite quotes in the entire movie. This is one of the most realistic stoner conversations I think I've ever heard in a movie. And what's interesting about it is I think before this, a lot of stoner conversations were just dumb. But you really get the sense that Slater is a smart stoner. Like this George Washington stuff might not be entirely accurate, but you know there's a connection between George Washington and hemp. And it's something that I remember even talking about in the 90s. It's something that a lot of kids, I think, talked about in high school. It's something even that Andy Slater, the real classmate of Richard Linklater, says that he talked about in high school. And he's convinced that Linklater wrote this into the movie because Andy Slater talked about it in real life. Linklater says that's not the case. Linklater even says that this conversation about George Washington and weed was supposed to be in Slacker and didn't end up in there. Okay, an interesting thing about Jason London and Michelle Burke making out in this movie is that there's a lot of talk about Michelle Burke just being a very flirtatious person in real life, which Michelle Burke says was true. There's a chapter in this book where they talk about how some of the other actresses in this movie were upset that she was flirting with their boyfriends. And Chrissy Harnos, who plays Kay, who's kind of the feminist character in this movie, was the real life girlfriend of Jason London at the time that they were making this movie. And she says she was really paranoid that Michelle Burke was sleeping with Jason London. Jason London and Michelle Burke both say, no way, didn't happen. Jason London was super in love with Chrissy Harnos and never would have cheated on her. But this feels like a very real thing to me. I mean, so many assholes cheating on their girlfriends in high school. Linklater says that he put this in part because he was given some notes by Universal saying, you know, Pink's kind of a guy with no tension. Nothing bad happens with him. He's kind of a good guy to Mitch, and you need some tension. So Linklater put this in partly to kind of show a little bit of tension between him, you know, having this girlfriend, Simone, and cheating on her with Jody, but also because Linklater remembers, he says, by his own account, kind of being a guy with a wandering eye when he was in high school. the spooky stuff on the dollar bill cracks me up, because I remember even in the 90s when this came out, having dollar bills that circulated that had a little stamp on the $1 bill with George Washington that would make George Washington say, "I grew hemp." So this woman who plays Julie, her name is Catherine Avril Morris. She's an interesting person because she was a real Austin high school kid, and they actually got her to help in casting. So she passed out casting cards to all of her friends in high school, and got a lot of her good friends to be in the movie. So that's why it kind of felt like it had a real authentic high school vibe. A lot of these kids knew each other in the movie. And I guess Catherine went to high school with Wiley Wiggins' older sister for a little while. So Wiley Wiggins and Catherine Avril Morris knew each other a little bit in high school. And I'll actually get back to that in a minute, but I think it contributed to some awkwardness when Wiley Wiggins and Catherine Avril Morris had to make out in that scene where Summer Breeze is playing. I'll talk about that later. So I love this scene because I think you see Darla as kind of a funny bitch in the beginning of the movie. And I'm glad that they show this much darker side to her later in the movie. I think when I first watched this movie when I was in high school, I hated that I was in a theater of a bunch of people who would laugh at these bullies, because I remembered being on the other side of those bullies, that I was always the kid being picked on, as I'm sure a lot of people can remember themselves too. But when I watch this as an adult, I see this scene as sad. Like, you really feel for Darla. She seems like a really messed up person, and you think like she must have come from a household where some pretty messed up things were going on. And I think that's another tribute to Dazed and Confused, is you really see these kids as these child bullies. Like, they seem kind of vulnerable in this movie. This fight scene is so great. So Adam Goldberg and Nikki Katt insist that when they were kind of going through the motions for this, that some of the crew members thought that it was a real fight and pulled them apart from each other. I don't know if I actually believe that, but it just seems so real. Like, it's so jagged. It's kind of over before it starts. You see this circle pulling around them, which I totally remember from high school when kids got in fights. And Adam Goldberg's so good in this scene. He's kind of crying at the end. It just really touches me. Yeah, the way his voice kind of cracks at the end there. I also find it interesting that he calls him a fascist. He calls him a Nazi at one point. He calls him a fascist. There's never anything overt that says that his character is supposed to be Jewish in this movie, but you kind of sense that he's Jewish just because Adam Goldberg is half Jewish in real life. And I used to wonder, what is this Jewish kid doing in Texas? But somebody told me when I was doing this book that I guess Galveston, Texas was a place where a lot of Jewish immigrants from Europe came after World War II, that it was kind of a hub. So there ended up being a pretty significant Jewish population in Texas, which is interesting. So Richard Linklater's older sister, Trisha, was the inspiration for this character, Jody, because obviously Mitch was a version of Linklater when he was younger. And Trish told me that this is kind of based on the truth, that whenever she did things and got in trouble, that her mom would kind of crack down hard on her. And whenever Linklater did, by the time he came along, that he was kind of allowed to do things. Or maybe not allowed, but kind of got away with doing things that she never got away with herself. That might just be like a younger kid thing, because I remember getting away with a lot of things that my sister didn't get away with. I love this scene with Cole Hauser thinking he's not drunk and can stand up and then realizing he's way too drunk to stand. Cole Hauser says he came up with that himself. And also says that he drank a lot and partied a lot during Dazed and Confused, which doesn't surprise me. Watch McConaughey kind of from here on out. You can see that his eyes are kind of droopy from here on out. And he does say that he took a hit off a real joint at some point during the filming of these Moon Tower party scenes. And you can kind of tell there's a difference between how everyone's acting at the beginning of these party scenes and how everyone's acting at the end. Also, these pants. Jason London picking out these pants. This is genius. He was like, I wanted to pick the most disgusting, tight, nut hugger pants I could possibly pick. A lot of the actors got to pick out their clothes from a giant warehouse full of 70s clothing. And I also love that, it's not what we normally think of from the 70s. It's not like bright reds and these kind of flashy 70s colors. It's more like browns and kind of regional stuff. There's like a lot of Texas belt buckles and boots and things like that. This was 1992 when they shot this. So the costume people always tell me that it was a little bit before thrift store shopping got really mainstream. So they just found amazing stuff. Like they'd find stuff from the 70s in a thrift store that was still in its original package that they ended up using in the movie. And a lot of people told me like, oh man, that shirt that Wiley Wiggins is wearing at the party, I had that exact same shirt when I was in high school. Makes it authentic. Oh yeah, look at the droopy eyelids there. Watch the leather man. So in the original version of the script, Pickford was supposed to be on this football field with the rest of these kids. But because everyone hated Shawn Andrews so much, by the end of filming, I guess Linklater replaced him with McConaughey. McConaughey kind of was very lucky that Shawn Andrews was really disliked by all the rest of these kids because he got invited into scenes where he wasn't originally supposed to be there, like this scene here. And at first you're kind of like, why is this older guy on a high school football field? Like that seems kind of weird and creepy, like you wouldn't normally do that. But in a way, they kind of needed him here because he's the older guy and he kind of gives them some wisdom. Like these kids don't know of anything that's going to happen to their lives after high school. And this is the one guy who knows that like not every night is going to be like this. By the way, a ton of the dialogue here was not scripted. Like when Jason London is doing that breakdown, only the strong survive thing, I guess that came from a real teacher at his high school who used to recount, war stories from his glory days in the military and used to say, only the strong survive. So they put that in the movie. Okay, I love this part coming up where Adam Goldberg's character talks about how, like, when Hemingway fought, they never talked about who lost or who won. They just talk about the battle, which obviously serves him because he lost. But there's a number of times in this movie where right after something happens, you hear these high school kids recounting a story. It's almost like even as they're experiencing it, they're realizing that this is going to become part of the mythology of their high school experience for decades to come. I think that's kind of a beautiful touch. Like you hear O'Bannon talk about when Carl's mom pulls a shotgun on him, and then, very, very soon afterward, he's like, she pulled a shotgun on me, and he's already retelling the story as if it's going to become part of the high school lore. Oh, this scene with this kiss, this tiny little kiss that Anthony Rapp gives to Kristen Hinojosa is so sweet. Kristen Hinojosa told me that Anthony Rapp used breath spray before he did this kiss, which I find hilarious and also, kind of thoughtful and sweet. By the way, Anthony Rapp had a fling with someone else in the cast. I'm not going to tell you who, but it's kind of surprising who it is. That is part of my book as well. Okay, so this stuff about Wooderson reading The Pledge. So Pickford was originally supposed to be where Wooderson is here. But so a lot of this came out of Matthew McConaughey. His dad died, as I mentioned before, not too long before they shot this scene. And I guess McConaughey was talking with Linklater about the impact of his dad. And he was like, it just made me realize it's about living, ain't it? And this thing about living ended up being this just keep living speech that he gives in the scene. And I don't totally know what it means. Like, you can watch it again and it seems profound, and then you're like, wait, he's not really saying anything. But I think that's kind of real too. That kind of seems profound when you're stoned, and maybe the next day you're like, I don't totally get it. But he does bring a little bit of this like cosmic cowboy poetry to this scene. It's a real tribute to McConaughey. This is my favorite line in the entire movie. This remind me to kill myself line. Linklater says that he wanted Dazed and Confused to be an anti-nostalgia movie. And I think this is him blatantly saying, these are not the best years of your life. This is my favorite scene. This, Lee Daniel doing this wraparound scene where Jason London's looking off into the distance. Oh, wanted to tell you, this "yeah, right, Mr. Premature Ejaculation" was also not in the original script. So apparently Sasha Jensen, when he was in this movie, he was like, my character is just this pig, so in real life, I'm just going to flirt with everyone. So he was flirting with Dina Martin the entire time. And Dina Martin had this boyfriend, as I mentioned, Peter Milius. So I guess right before they were going to shoot this scene, Peter Milius was like, I'm going to get Sasha Jensen back for flirting with you the entire time. And I want you to say, yeah, right, Mr. Premature Ejaculation, but we're not going to tell him that you're going to say that. So you'll see in that scene that when she says that, he looks really surprised, and he tackles her, and that was real because he didn't expect her to say that line. Again, it's like, why would these cops show up and bust these kids just for being on the football field? Well, it's because in the original version of this movie, the cops were there to bust them for stealing the statues, but that ended up getting cut out of the movie. Okay, so this summer breeze scene is one of my favorite scenes in the whole movie. I feel like a lot of people can remember what it's like to make out with someone for the first time on an itchy blanket in the grass. I really recommend, if you have the Criterion version of Dazed and Confused, to watch the interviews that Kahani Cooperman did with these two actors, with Wiley Wiggins and Catherine Averill Morris, because she interviews them before they have this makeout scene. And Wiley Wiggins told me that he'd never really kissed anybody before he shot this scene. So when you see them interviewed, they're both talking about what it's going to be like to kiss each other. And it's just the most awkward thing ever. Catherine Averill Morris is like, you know how sometimes people kiss you and they drool everywhere and they're bad kissers? And you can see Wiley Wiggins just dying next to her because they're going to have to shoot that scene, and he knows that he's going to have to kiss someone for the first time, and he might not be a good kisser. So I kind of love that this whole thing about the drug pledge is the supposed plot of this movie. It's kind of a red herring because it's like the movie really doesn't need a plot. Who cares whether he signs this thing or not? I like that there's kind of an anti-climax for the climax. I think that also feels very real to high school. Like sometimes the biggest, most dramatic thing is just whether or not you're going to sign a drug pledge. And it really ends that way too. Like there's no coda saying what happened to these kids after graduation. They're not even graduating. They're going back the next year because they're juniors. So it really ends with them driving off to get Aerosmith tickets. But, it's going to be a really long drive. And once they get there, they're going to have to wait in line for a long time. So it's not like this ride that they have in the car is going to be this epic drive. It kind of ends on an anticlimax note, and I kind of love that. Okay, so Richard Linklater says that this was also based on a real thing. I guess the first time he really was out all night partying, his mom told him that he had one get out of jail free card, which I love. Also, this actress here was, I guess, a kind of well-known acting coach in Austin, and apparently taught some acting classes to Richard Linklater. I think it's kind of nice touch that she plays his mom here. Okay, don't you love this room that Wiley Wiggins has? Whoever decorated this, what is this weird bell thing that he has by his light switch? What is that? It's so weird. But just the details are so authentic. It's so great. And this scene where he's just like putting on these headphones to block out his mom, so great. Also, the fact that Slow Ride is playing for the second time in this movie feels so real. Like when you're a teenager, you're just kind of hearing the same songs over and over again on the radio. And I think it's a really nice way to end the movie with a song that we've heard before. By the way, again, in the end, it was supposed to be Pickford driving the car, but because people hated him, they ended up having Matthew McConaughey driving the car. And because this was kind of a melancholy moment, it was the last scene they shot, Joey Lauren Adams says that they were really smoking a real joint in this scene. It was just kind of the send-off, and it was like, what is Richard Linklater going to do? Is he going to fire us? No way, the movie's over. So there's a funny thing I want to talk about at the end here. Originally, the song in the very end of this movie was supposed to be Led Zeppelin's Rock and Roll, and it was really, really important to Richard Linklater to use rock and roll. So he courted Led Zeppelin with this, and Jimmy Page said yes. I talk about how he courted him in my book. But Robert Plant said no, and didn't allow rock and roll in the movie. So I'm going to read you a little thing that Richard Linklater wrote in his diary, which I find hilarious. Okay, this is where it starts. The official reason is that it is, quote, in direct competition with his solo career, end quote. Plant doing lame covers of old songs and uninspired new garbage is not much of a solo career, but hey, by not having a Zeppelin tune in this movie, everyone will naturally forget Zeppelin, and Mr. Plant's only viable blip on the music history scene ever existed. Then they will all run out and purchase this pathetically aging rock star who still wants to look and act like he did 20 years ago in his illustrious solo album. Yeah, right. It's always the lesser talents who have the major attitudes. Everyone knows who the major architect behind Zeppelin is. One's a musical genius. One's a construction worker with a good voice. Ouch. Lifetime boycott. So Linklater actually published this in the Austin Chronicle after the movie came out, one day after the movie came out. And I guess it caused a little bit of an ongoing feud between him and Robert Plant, which I talk about in the book. I find that kind of hilarious. One other interesting thing is that so throughout the whole making of this movie, as I mentioned before, Linklater was fighting with people from Universal over a lot of the choices that were made in the movie. And it all kind of culminated with one song. So Universal really wanted to have this band Jackal, which was kind of a hard rock band that like used chainsaws on stage. Like you could just imagine what they were like. They wanted Jackal to cover the 70s song We're an American Band and use it over the second half of the credits. Which Jim Jackson's like, it's the second half of the credits. No one cares. But I think it speaks to Linklater's attention to detail and what makes this movie so authentic that Linklater was like, no way. I'm not going to have a contemporary band, especially not that band, cover a 70s song. So this was really the culmination of his fight with Universal. He was like, I was ready to go up there with a razor and start cutting myself unless they let me use the music that I wanted to use in this movie. Luckily, that didn't happen. The soundtrack got kind of moved around. Universal didn't want anything to do with it for a while, but obviously Dazed and Confused is now known as one of the best rock and roll movies of all time. So Universal was wrong. I think, Richard Linklater chose kind of the perfect music for this movie. One last thing I wanted to bring up before I end this commentary. You know, it's interesting to me, when I saw this movie in the 90s, it seemed like not much had changed since the 70s in teenage life. Like, you know, as I mentioned before, we were still listening to Aerosmith, you know, we were smoking weed, we were driving around in cars, and kind of all that stuff was still similar. But now I really wonder if kids see this as just a total time capsule. It's like, you know, weed is legal now. No one really listens to rock music anymore. People take a Lyft or an Uber when they want to get around. You're not that desperate to hang out with people you don't know if you can just be online and get into the stuff that you're interested in there. Kids aren't really bored in the same way. I'm sure they're still bored, but they're bored in different ways than they were in the 90s or in the 70s. So it's just interesting. You know, Linklater originally wanted to make this movie to show that teenage culture hasn't changed. And I think Dazed and Confused might have been popular because it was so relatable at one point, but now I think it might be popular simply because it's such a time capsule. Somebody said in my book that one of the ongoing theories about movies and TV is that if you want to make something really popular, you should set it in an age before social media, because it's a fantasy that everyone shares to live in a time before social media. So that might be part of the reason why Dazed and Confused is so popular too. Anyway, thanks so much for listening to this commentary. And if you want to check out more about Dazed and Confused, check out my book. It's called All Right, All Right, All Right.
That's right. Do what Melissa Maerz asks of you, people. Seek out her book, All Right, All Right, All Right. I've beaten the Matthew McConaughey accent, if you could call it that. I beat it like a dead horse, so I'm done doing the voice. You can't get me to do it anymore. But check out the book from HarperCollins, in stores, online, available November 17th. Thanks for everybody taking the time. I appreciate it. If you're loving the podcast, hey, give us some of that love. Rate us, review us, retweet us. The 3 R's. The 3 iconic R's of podcast success. It's in your court. We'll see you next week with, I'm telling you, an amazing interview and an amazing feature-length audio commentary from an iconic filmmaker. That's here on The Sidetrack.